Hello guys, welcome to another video. Now about a week ago, I made a video talking about some leaked Path of Exile 2 Keystones that had come out from one of the press interviews at the Tokyo Game Show, and some of those Keystones were returning Keystones from Path of Exile 1 which had been changed quite significantly, and others were completely new Keystones. So in this video we're going to be talking about a few more of those Keystones, beginning with Acrobatics. Now, Acrobatics, of course, in Path of Exile 1 is a keystone which converts your spell suppression into spell dodge. And since spell suppression is going away completely in Path of Exile 2 because there will no longer be any distinction of damage types from monsters, that means that this keystone was either going to go away completely or it was going to be changed into something else, and it looks like they're going to keep it and change it into something completely different. So now Acrobatics in Path of Exile 2 has all hits can be evaded and 50% reduced evasion rating. Now, we don't know exactly if the translation is correct here, whether it's 50% reduced evasion rating or 50% less. That's quite an important distinction, as currently in Path of Exile 1, being able to counter 50% reduced would be fairly trivial because it's additive with any increases that you have. But if it was 50% less evasion rating, that would be significantly worse as a downside and it'd be much harder to overcome. So what about this first line, all hits can be evaded? What exactly does that mean? Well, we know that in Path of Exile 2, as I mentioned before, the distinction of monster spells and monster attacks is going to be completely removed from the game, and there's just going to be monster hits. And any monster hit which is considered to be a projectile or a strike can be evaded or blocked. So this is going to make it much easier on the player visually when they're actually playing the game to see what they can block or evade and what they can't. If it's a giant AoE effect that's coming down on top of your character or it's coming up from the ground underneath you, you probably can't evade or block that ability. But this keystone is going to make it so that all hits can be evaded, including those area effect abilities that you previously could not evade. That's actually really quite a strong keystone, as I mentioned before, depending on whether the translation is correct for this or not. Of course, we don't really know in PoE2 how easy it's going to be to actually get increases to evasion rating. Currently, as it stands in Path of Exile 1, it's much easier to counter this downside if it was reduced evasion rating, like the translation said. And if it's less there, I think it's going to be a different story entirely, but this is still a fun keystone, and I think it's quite a cool idea being able to evade all hits. And next up, we've got Mind Over Matter. Now, I know a lot of people were making a big deal of this one. So, Mind Over Matter in Path of Exile 1, as it currently stands, will redirect 40% of damage to your mana before life. And in Path of Exile 2, it looks like it's going to make 100% of damage be taken from mana before life. And it's also going to impose a 50% reduction on the mana regeneration rate that you have. Now, the excitement around this keystone for the change in Path of Exile 2, I think, has come about because right now in Path of Exile 1, it's basically impossible to obtain 100% of all damage to be taken from mana before life without having legacy gear. And there are ways to get different damage types up to 100%. For example, you can reach 100% of lightning damage taken from mana before life. But no matter what you do in the current game with non-legacy gear, you can't get all damage types to be taken 100% from mana before life. Now, I think people are excited about the combination of using this new keystone in Path of Exile 2 with Chaos Inoculation. So Chaos Inoculation makes it so that you're immune to chaos damage and you have one life. And the idea there is that should you run out of all of your energy shield, you would then have one life, but of course all damage is being redirected to mana. So you would also have that secondary life pool there, and you could use those two keystones together. Now, that combination of mechanics, if it existed in Path of Exile 1, would be incredibly powerful because there's a lot of ridiculous scaling you can do. For example, you can get a lot of extra energy shield gain from stacking mana. That's very powerful. But in Path of Exile 2, we'd kind of lack the context to see if this will be strong or not. And we also haven't seen Chaos Inoculation just yet in Path of Exile 2. Correct me if I'm wrong, this may have been shown off somewhere, but I believe we haven't seen that keystone just yet. So it's possible that they've changed that keystone a little bit or a lot, as some of the keystones we can see in the leaked keystones we've seen so far are old returning keystones, but they've been massively changed, sometimes doing something completely different than they previously were. So whether Chaos Inoculation makes it into the game in its Path of Exile 1 state is yet to be seen. But I do want to talk about this keystone for just a moment, mind over matter, and talk about the downside. 50% reduced mana regeneration rate. I think this is actually a really substantially strong downside, and I think in Path of Exile 2 we already know that recovery in terms of standard recovery resources that are non-flask based are going to be a bit lower. We've heard that from developers when they talk about recovery. They're not really a big fan of Path of Exile 1 players being able to stack thousands of life regen and mana regen and things like that. So I think that this downside of having 50% reduced mana regeneration rate is actually going to be quite significant. And there's also the case there where we don't know exactly how mana flasks are going to work and what kind of modifiers you can get on them and how accessible and how easy they're going to be to maintain. And next up we have Vaal Pact. So this keystone in Path of Exile 2, it's going to grant 100% of life leech is instant and cannot use life flasks. So once again, going back to that discussion on flasks, I think that flasks are going to be really important in Path of Exile 2, but for a very different reason for how they're important in Path of Exile 1. I think that a lot of builds, even builds that are not stacking mana, for example, are going to be using flasks very regularly just for normal recovery of life or mana. So this keystone disabling the use of life flask is a really big deal, but at the same time it grants 100% of life leech being instant. And just from looking at this keystone, I feel like instant life leech is probably going to be a stat which is either exceedingly rare, or this is possibly the only way you'll be able to obtain that stat. Because right now in Path of Exile 1, it's very easy to obtain instant leech. You can get it just by clicking on a mastery, you can get 10% of it. This keystone granting 100% of life leech as instant is quite powerful, but the fact that you can't use life flasks as a trade-off for this kind of makes me think that life leech being instant is going to be a rare stat to make this keystone actually good. And lastly for this video, we have Avatar of Fire, which now has 75% of non-fire damage converted to fire damage and deal no non-fire damage. So this one makes me really excited for buildcraft in Path of Exile 2 because we already know that damage conversion is going to work a bit differently. They're kind of going back to their original concept of damage conversion way back in the early days of Path of Exile, which is the idea that you can convert damage from one type to another, but the damage that you deal is only then scaled by that damage type. For example, if you convert physical damage to fire damage in Path of Exile 1 as it stands right now, you can scale that damage with any modifiers to physical damage or fire damage. But in Path of Exile 2, that damage would only be scalable with modifiers to fire damage because it's no longer physical damage, and damage will no longer remember its origin type. So this keystone becomes really interesting because it's going to allow you to convert any damage type you want into fire, and of course you're going to have to be able to find the rest of that conversion somewhere else, which I can only assume will be somewhat accessible on gear pieces or other nodes on the tree, or possibly on ascendancies. But I think it's really cool, the idea of being able to, convert a chaos skill into fire, because we can't do that right now in Path of Exile 1. And all of the possible builds that come out from the new conversion mechanics in Path of Exile 2, I can't wait for those. Just a quick reminder that everything is subject to change. That's all of these keystones. Pretty much all of the mechanics before the full release of Path of Exile 2 are subject to change, so these are just kind of ideas perhaps for now. They may not be exactly right in terms of numbers, but it's interesting to take a look at the concepts with these keystones. What do you think of these leaked Path of Exile 2 keystones? Let me know by commenting below. Thanks for watching this video, and as always, stay tuned and stay safe.